Hi, I'm Kavitah Wade, and this is Economic Divide. March 17 is election time in Israel. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is he up for the challenge? One headline read, "Focused on Iran, Bibi ignores Israel's economic crisis." Well, we are not going to do that. In fact, that's what we're going to focus on. Some of the highlights of today's program.
With the Israeli economy is that it's divided. It's an apartheid economy.
Israel, an apartheid regime, yes. But an apartheid economy? How about money laundering?
Israel is one of the countries that has no prohibitions against money laundering.
Also look at Stav Shafir.
אנחנו אלה שיצאנו לרחובות והגענו עד לכנסת כדי שלא יתעלמו יותר מהאזרחים במדינה שלנו.
Israel's economy had solid growth for years. It recorded roughly between 4 to 6% growth until the 2008 financial crisis hit. Unlike other economies, it has had a hard time recovering. Well, these days, recovering is a term that's used loosely when it comes to economies. We will prove in the following minutes that Israel's economy is not only not recovering, it is free-falling. Yet its economy was not supposed to be a capitalist one, but rather it was originally a social democracy. This is Israel. Some of the major cities: Tel Aviv, Haifa, Israel's population estimated to be around 8 million in 2014. About 6 million are Israelis, while the second largest group are Arabs, standing at around 2 million people.
If we talk about the Israeli population, Israel started off as a socialist democracy.
He's also the author of the only book that he has ever written, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, in which he wrote how the son of an Israeli general and a staunch Zionist supporter came to realize the true colors of Israel, that it's a terrorist entity.
And then you've got the Israeli army, which I like to refer to as one of the best trained, best equipped, best fed terrorist organizations in the world. And yes, they have generals and they have nice uniforms, but their entire purpose is terrorism.
But that all changed when Israel decided to change and adopt capitalist neoliberal policies. And today, again, as is typical in many economies that follow this model, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
Israel, we have to remember, started out as a socialist country. The original Labor Party of Israel, which is now trying to regain power in the upcoming election on March the 17th. The whole idea of Israeli labor was socialism, maybe with a small s, but it was still socialism. The kibbutz system, kibbutz is a word that means commune, so you could say small c communism. There was state-owned enterprises were the rule of the day in the former Israel. Now we've seen privatization, as we've seen in other countries, and this has hurt the middle class, because when you have rampant privatization, that means that the cost of certain services goes up, whether it's people's electric bills or their water bills, the cost of public transportation. When these enterprises are privatized, then the market sets the price rather than the government.
So how is Israel's economy doing? This was how the OECD saw it. After pronounced but temporary weakening in 2014, growth projected to rebound to about 3% in 2015. The IMF in February wrote, IMF says Israel's economic outlook remains solid, but the outlook below the headline was what was telling. It highlighted 3 possible threats to the economy. It first noted that public debt remained high despite a noticeable decrease over the past several years. It also said that rapid house price inflation, if it persisted, posed risk to financial stability.
The issue with the Israeli economy is that it's divided. It's an apartheid economy. So you've got the reality that exists among the Israeli Jews, and then you've got the reality that exists among Palestinians.
Well, I think the Israeli economy is really an adjunct to the economies of the United States and Western Europe. And across the board, in Europe, in the United States, and in Israel, the real economy is doing poorly. In the case of Europe, it's in a state of real collapse with very few exceptions, maybe Germany being about the only exception.
But I think what's important to realize is that even though Palestinians make up the majority of the population in the entire country, they are still not able to participate in the economy. They are shunned away from the major economic development. And even Palestinians who are Israeli citizens are, again, living below the poverty line at very high rates, over 52, 53%. So they're denied access to water. Palestinians, for example, only get 3% of the water. You can't have development without water. They're denied access to land. Palestinians cannot purchase or lease land in the vast majority of the country.
The United States, the real economy, is doing poorly, and a lot of the hype around the stock market being over 18,000, bank profits being up enormously, really conceals the fact that you've got a widening gap between the upper 1% super rich and the conditions of life for the overwhelming majority of the population. So in that sense, Israel is a reflection of that overall malaise within the Western economies as a whole.
This growing disparity, or the 1% versus the 99%, had become a big problem in Israel. It was building over the years. An economy that had steady growth at 5 to 6% per year had now slowed to half, or maybe just a little more. Income inequality had showed its face in a big way. This study by the Bank of Israel showed how deep a problem the widening social class had become. Based on a study, income inequality growing faster in Israel than in other developed nations. It said that the Bank of Israel reported lack of state involvement, heterogeneous population growth for the disparity, study also indicating that growing gap between the educated and the uneducated. Of noted significance, the study revealed that over the last 20 years, the salary gaps between educated and uneducated workers had grown.
It's well known that the majority of the wealth is held by a handful of very wealthy families. They own the banks, they own the major corporations, and so forth.
About 18 families in Israel control roughly 60% of the equity value of all companies in Israel.
The reality, of course, is that for Israeli Jews, the economy is doing better. I think the poverty line among the Israeli Jews is at around 10 or 12%, while in the Palestinian population it's over 50% are below the poverty line. So you have a discrepancy completely between the two populations.
Israel has several additional problems that compound things and make them even worse. Number one, there is a segment of the population that is subsidized. The ultra-Orthodox get all kinds of special perks, make very little contribution to the real economy of Israel. Many ultra-Orthodox are exempted from military service and are living on a kind of a state religious welfare system. Similarly, there are enormous subsidies provided to the settlers, the illegal settlers in the West Bank, and now increasingly stretching out into the West Bank from Jerusalem. Israel is one of the countries that has no prohibitions against money laundering. And therefore, there is a third element of the Israeli economy that also adds to the disproportion. namely that there are a lot of international criminal elements that use Israel's economy as a money laundering pass-through, much the same way that some of the Caribbean offshore islands, the Cayman Islands, the Dutch Antilles, and places like Dubai in the Middle East are used as money laundering havens.
Her name is Stav Shafir, Israel's youngest lawmaker to join the Finance Committee. She was shocked to find out that Israel was pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into illegal settlements via a secret budget without the Knesset ever knowing about it. What makes her interesting in this case is that she was one of the key leaders of the social protests of 2011. Oh, by the way, she's also part of the Zionist Union, featuring Israel's opposition leader and Labor Party leader, Isaac Herzog.
About 2.5 years ago, I think it was the summer of 2012, there were widespread protests in all of the major cities in Israel, an outpouring from the middle class and blue-collar strata, complaining bitterly about how the economy was stacked against them. She's one of the people who emerged on the scene politically back during those summer of 2012 demonstrations.
Hello, I'm Stav Shafir.
Stav Shafir, thank you very much for joining us today on The Candidates.
Thank you for having me.
At age 29, you were the youngest member of Knesset. Now, you joined politics 2 years ago in 2013 after having led the hugely popular social protests that got almost 500,000 people onto the streets of Israel. Now, within 2 years in politics, you've shot right up to the 3rd place in the Labour Party list, which makes you 4th on the Zionist Union joint list.
אנחנו אלה שיצאנו לרחובות והגענו עד לכנסת כדי שלא יתעלמו יותר מהאזרחים במדינה שלנו. אנחנו נלחם עד שהצדק החברתי ינצח. ואנחנו, או הוא. 3 years ago, the people in Israel rose to the streets in an amazing movement against the government policy. It started with a very small group of people who protested on housing prices, but it became a protest on the relation between citizens and the states. It spread into the whole of Israel with 120 tent camps all across the country.
Because we're all so busy working and earning our money for rent, we never managed to get out into the streets. What's happening now is that finally people have decided they've had enough.
Yes!
The demonstration started to be such large scale 2 weeks ago when an Israeli girl posted on Facebook a post that she's going to open a tent actually here in Tel Aviv and to demonstrate for the very crazy cost of housing in Israel in general.
This is our home. We can't even get this one place. We're being pushed away from our cities and our workplaces.
I'm working 12 hours a day and I don't have enough to actually finish the month. I closed my office. I'm a lawyer and I closed my office because I couldn't afford the rent. I hope we can get into the heart of the Israeli people and say this is not a left issue or right issue. The government for years tried to separate us from all kinds of issues. If it's Arabs and Jews, if it's left and right, if it's settlers or not settlers, our problems is economic. us the same all over again, that we have a security issues, and for security we need money. This is Machiavellism one-on-one. Let the people know that they have an enemy on the other side, and they will do whatever you want. Enough, it's enough.
The energy is enormous. Last week we were marching through the streets and the Prime Minister was shaking.
Now we're opening our eyes. What you see behind you is Jewish people and Arab people, Christian and Muslim, together.
נתניהו הוא אבי השיטה, נתניהו הוא זה שאילץ למשל את המוסדיות, את קופות הגמל ואת קרנות הפנסיה להשקיע בשוק ולשים את כספם על קרן יצחק תשובה, בן דוב ואוליגרכים אחרים. נתניהו הוא זה שריסק בעקביות ובשיטתיות את הרשת החברתית שלנו, והוא זה שמנסה עכשיו לחסל את חברת החשמל. סולר, אבל רק 14 שקל לטון של מזוט, כשהוא יודע שלחברת החשמל אסור להשתמש במזוט. המטרה שלהם היא לשבור את חברת החשמל, שיש לה ועד חזק, ולהפריט אותה.
אנחנו השבוע נעשה שני דברים גדולים. אחד, נעביר את הרפורמות במינהל מקרקעי ישראל בוועדות התכנון והבנייה. והדבר השני, אנחנו ננקוט שורה של צעדים ממוקדים במטרה לעזור גם לזוגות צעירים וגם לסטודנטים וגם לאוכלוסיות נזקקות אחרות.
This is who Netanyahu elected to deal with the problems during that time. Professor Manuel Trachtenberg, who headed the committee established to examine the cost of living.
Okay, so I'm Professor Manuel Trachtenberg from Israel. I'm currently the head of the national higher education system in Israel. And previously I've been the head of the National Economic Council at the Prime Minister's office.
4 years later, Trachtenberg accused Netanyahu of neglecting the cost of living issues and said Netanyahu's policies have created a generation mired in hopelessness. Which is why in these elections, Israelis came out again, blasting Netanyahu's policies.
6 שנים בהם ישראל לא הייתה תקועה יותר מאשר הפעם הזו. פני האזור או ליצירתו של עתיד טוב יותר.
We've organized this demonstration in order to initiate real change as a major grassroots initiative in Israel. We believe that we need both a change from a defense perspective, political perspective, a social perspective, an economic perspective, and we are a platform for the expression of the people's will to demand this change and to see a new government that acts in the field to make changes in all of these areas.
And for those reasons, Stav Shafir and her party, the Zionist Union, are winning Israelis over, like this speech that she gave in the Knesset.
חברים, חבריי מהימין, הפחד ניכר מעיניכם. אתם פשוט מפחדים. אתם מפחדים בגלל שבשנתיים האחרונות חשפנו את השחיתויות שלכם. חשפנו איך מאחורי המעטה האידיאולוגי אתם לקחתם את כספי הציבור הישראלי, את כספי המיסים שהציבור עבד כל כך קשה בשבילם, והעברתם אותם לחברים שלכם, לחלוקת ג'ובים, למקורבים, לפעילים, לעמותות פרטיות. איך מפלגת הבית היהודי, שמעמידה פנים שהיא יותר ציונית מבן גוריון, איך המפלגה הזאת לקחה את כספי הציבור במקום להעביר אותם לפרי גליל ולערד, במקום להעביר אותם לבתי החולים כדי להגדיל את כמות המיטות, במקום ללכת ולרווח את כיתות הלימוד, במקום לעשות פה תחבורה ציבורית מצוינת, לקחתם את הכסף שלנו וזרקתם אותו, חילקתם אותו במתנה לחברים שלכם, לעמותות פרטיות שבראשן עומדים אנשי הבית היהודי. איפה נפתלי בנט שיגיב על הפרשה של העברת מענק של 36 מיליון שקלים לעמותת מועצת ישע בשעה שהוא עמד בראשה ובאופן לא חוקי דרך ועדת כספים? איפה?
תגיבו ותענו. אתם לוקחים והופכים את הקופה הציבורית לסחר מחר, לקומבינה פוליטית בידיים שלכם, במקום לדאוג למדינה. אתם שכחתם מהנגב ומהגליל כדי להעביר 1.2 מיליארד שקלים להתנחלויות בבונוסים.
Did she say 1.2 billion shekels for illegal settlements? Yes, she did. However, she revealed this in the Knesset on February 2015. The bombshell came a week later. Israel pouring billions into settlements via secret budget, Stav Shafir told Haaretz. When Israel's youngest lawmaker joined the Finance Committee, she was shocked to discover huge sums of money being allocated without Knesset's oversight.
When I got into the Finance Committee, I discovered that Israel has two budgets. One budget that is being passed legally on the Knesset floor, and another secret budget that is being transferred in the Finance Committee secretly, sometimes with no Knesset members even sitting inside and with no supervision.
Yes, well, I think it's, again, this is a very well-known secret that Israel has the mainstream or the more legal aspect of its policies and budget with regard to what was, considered the 1948 Palestine. And then there's another type of policy and another type of budget for the West Bank and Gaza, which are, the rest of Palestine that was occupied in 1967. And this is how Israel operates. I believe it was when Ariel Sharon was the housing minister earlier in his career that this massive allocation of funds without oversight into the West Bank and other areas that he chose to develop and build settlements began. And this has been going on ever since. It's been several decades now. So again, I don't know why anybody would be surprised by this, but it's true that there are two budgets. One is the one that is publicized, and the one is not publicized.
Well, it's shocking that there would be a secret slush fund supporting these activities, but we've seen this happen in other countries as well. And the fact that the member of the Knesset from the Labor Party discovered this is an indication of how polarized Israeli politics has become. The fact that yes, where does this money come from? We know that Israel has a very powerful criminal syndicate, underworld. It's a lot of these people came out of Ukraine, Moldova, Russia, Uzbekistan, and other countries, and this is the dirty money aspect of Israeli politics. So if these individuals are bringing ill-gotten gains from smuggling, for example, which is a huge problem in Israel, if this money is winding up in slush fund activity, especially to build settlements in the West Bank, this is a huge scandal, and this again is just another potential political nail in Bibi Netanyahu's coffin.
As of the recording of this program, the elections in Israel had not taken place. What's certain is that an economy who puts its shekels in defending itself through wars and a BDS movement against its products made in the illegal settlements, with many of its people leaving Israel as a whole, not much hope remains for its economy. We're done for this edition. Our links and addresses are below. Really looking forward to hearing from you. Got some time? Drop us a line. We'll see you next week.